Well, we are always delighted to have Mrs. Reagan with us, but we are especially glad to have her here this evening. If you noticed, she might have been walking a little bit slow this evening. It's because she suffered a fall a few weeks ago and cracked 3 of her ribs. Yeah. And if any of you have such experience with that kind of injury, you know just how painful that can be. And while she's expected to make a full recovery, she's still not fully recuperated. In fact, she was advised that she should consider calling in sick tonight, but she insisted on being here to see her good friend, Tom Brokaw. So thank you so much for coming, Mrs. Reagan. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize some special guests that we have with us this evening, and I want to start with our outstanding Congressman, Elton Gallagly, and his wife, Janice. Elton, thank you for coming. Our Mayor of Simi Valley, Bob Huber. Bob. I also want to say hello to Diane Hendricks, all the way from Beloit, Wisconsin, who is a special friend of the library, and she's leading a campaign that will be bringing a terrific new statue of President Reagan here to the library in the next year. Thanks for coming, Diane. Now, as many of you know, last year, Mrs. Reagan had the honor of cutting the ribbon on the newly renovated Reagan Museum, a museum that, since that time, has seen almost 500,000 visitors who have gotten a whole new and exciting look at the life and times of our 40th president. And as I was walking through it several days ago, it struck me that there are 3 areas in this new museum where our visitors get a glimpse of our special guest this evening. I think this is only fitting. I know Mrs. Reagan would agree that it would be extremely difficult to chronicle the extraordinary life of Ronald Reagan, both as governor of California and as president of the United States, without the familiar voice and the running narrative of the times brought to us by Tom Brokaw. I think it's also fitting to remember that the arcs of the extraordinary lives of both Ronald Reagan and Tom Brokaw have similarities rooted in where they came from, their aspirations as young men, and their respective journeys now written into the national memory, both bold and plain for all to see. President Reagan, as a young man growing up in the Midwest town of Dixon, Illinois, to this day boasting a population of 15,000, had great aspirations. He got his start in radio in the towns of Davenport and Des Moines, Iowa, saddled up his talent, and found himself heading west to Los Angeles, California. It was movies and television that made him a household name on his way to the governor's office and the presidency. Young Tom Brokaw, raised in the Midwest as well, in the town of Yankton, South Dakota, along the banks of the Missouri River, population also 15,000 today, got his first job in television at KTIV in Sioux City, Iowa, and eventually found himself heading west to report for NBC News, where? Los Angeles, California. The year, 1966, right when Ronald Reagan was campaigning for election to his first public office as governor of California. It seems like the two were destined to meet. Tom is here today to talk with us, in part, about his 6th best-selling book, The Times of Our Lives. It follows on the heels of other great works he's produced, not the least of which include the books Boom and The Greatest Generation. Now, having read it, its central message brings to mind another similarity between these 2 great men, Ronald Reagan and Tom Brokaw. The book, much like countless Ronald Reagan speeches, and indeed his life's work, admirably takes on the challenge of inspiring Americans to make a positive difference in their families, their communities, and their country as we work together to revitalize the American dream. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a conversation with the award-winning journalist, historian, and author, Tom Brokaw.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming, Tom.
It's good to be back. You and I were talking earlier. You know, I was here for the 100th anniversary of the president's birth. We had a great panel up here with Richard Reeves and my friend Lou Cannon and Governor Wilson talking about that remarkable time. But Nancy, here's a story I don't think I've ever told in public before. When we were walking and I was reminded, you may not remember this, I was reminded when the day the president made his announcement that he would be running for a second term as governor of California. It was not unexpected, obviously. We all thought that he would be doing that. And the announcement was made at the Los Angeles Press Club. Because I knew so many members of the staff and so many of his supporters, I had wandered in, and of course with the bravura of a reporter, I walked into the inner sanctum and sat down at the end of a long bench where all the VIPs were gathered and just was waiting for it to start. You came in and you began to greet everybody who was kind of lined up around the room. And what happens is that people kind of go on autopilot. You know, Mrs. Reagan is saying hello to Buddy Epson and giving him a kiss, and then Jimmy Stewart and giving him a kiss, and then other friends of hers. And I'm sitting there thinking, God, she's going to get to me, what's she going to do? And she wasn't paying attention as she got to me and leaned over and then went, whoa, like this. And I said, oh, Mrs. Reagan, whatever I have, it's not catching, so it'll be okay. And she gave me a big smile and gave me a hug, and it was one more demonstration of her uncanny ability to always be graceful in the public eye and in private as well, and to be such an enormous asset to the president. So I don't think I've ever told that story before, but I remember it very well. And as a reporter, I also took it as one more demonstration of what an asset you were for the president at that time, the governor, and how important you were for it. We've got a lot of other stories, some of which we can tell and some of which we can't, obviously.
Well, speaking of those stories, Tom, I don't know that you want me to bring this one up, but there's one that I recall Mrs. Reagan telling. It's about you happening to completely destroy her birthday surprise for the president back in 1981. Can you tell us that one?
Oh, yeah, I will. The president and Mrs. Reagan had just moved into the White House, and I have the very, very happy experience of sharing the president's birthday, February 6th. It was my grandfather's birthday, and it was Ronald Reagan's birthday. It's a pretty good collection. Babe Ruth was born on February 6th. That's not so bad. So I was always conscious of the fact that it was his birthday, and I was doing the Today Show. Mrs. Reagan, unbeknownst to me, had made elaborate arrangements for a surprise birthday party, his first in the White House. They're up in the living quarters that morning, and they're watching, because they had such great taste, the Today Show. And there I am saying, well, it's the president's birthday today, and they're planning a big event tonight as a surprise. And Nancy immediately said to the president, oh, that Tom Brokaw never knows what he's talking about. There was another occasion that there's a tradition, and whoever there's the president, for kind of senior reporters to get a briefing on the State of the Union address. We have a luncheon at the White House, and it'll be the three anchors, prominent columnist Jim Lehrer from PBS, but George Will be there, and later Tom Friedman and others, and it's very helpful to us to get kind of an advance review of what the president's going to be talking about that night. So they bring in the foreign policy experts to talk about the foreign policy section, if they bring in the domestic advisors to talk about what the initiatives are going to be in the domestic area. We were all gathered there, and it turned out that on this State of the Union address, it was going to fall on the president's birthday, February 6th. I didn't say anything about the fact that we share the birthdays, but we got to the luncheon table and we were being briefed by the staff, and then they brought in President Reagan. And without checking with the rest of us, Dan Rather from CBS, my colleague sitting across the table, immediately jumps up and says, Mr. President, I'd like to ask my colleagues to stand and join me in singing Happy Birthday to you. So everybody, of course, gets up and they sing Happy Birthday to the president. When they finish, the president puts his arm around me with a twinkle in his eye and says, Dan, Tom and I really appreciate that. It's his birthday as well. I don't think that's what Dan had in mind, frankly, when he set out to do that.
That's great. Well, Tom, I've got a number of questions that I brought for you, and then I'm going to intersperse with them questions that have come from people here in the audience. They've been nice enough to write them on cards. I'm going to use them often because I looked at them. They're better than mine. But I'll start with one that's about the political environment today. Here we are, we're heading into the 2012 elections, and we're already at each other's throats. It's as partisan as it gets already. And I wondered, having read your book and knowing about your life, is there anything left in the United States, in America today, that you feel that we as Americans can be united about?
I do, and I by the way, I think this is the most polarizing campaign season I've ever been through, and it's on the left and on the right both. And what has happened is that the instrumentation, as I describe it, the internet has allowed people to kind of rally their troops and create these two polar opposites, and what's left out are the people in the middle, and there are Republicans and Democrats as well, but they may not go to the extremes, but they have other kinds of interest. I've been saying recently that we wake up every morning with a constant barrage of reminders about what divides us in this country, and we need to be thinking as well about what can unite us. We're always going to have these kinds of debates in an election year. That's the essence of a democracy. So I have been spending a lot of personal time and professional time on an issue that I think that it's an incumbent upon all of us, whatever our political beliefs, to unite us, and that is what we do about returning veterans of war from the two longest wars in our nation's history. Afghanistan and Iraq are longer than any other wars in which we have been involved. The young people who are involved there are all volunteers. They weren't drafted. They weren't told they had to go to war. They raised their hands, took an oath of office, and went off to a very, very difficult situation. Moreover, they come, a lot of them, from rural America and from working class America. They enlist when they're 18 or 19 years of age, or they're guardsmen or reservists who've done that because they have a sense of patriotism and also because they want to continue a military career in some fashion. Now, at the end of 10, 12 years, they're coming back. And they're coming back to a society that's a lot different than it was when they left. First of all, we have these political divisions. We have the sharpest economic downturn since the Great Depression. We all are keenly aware of that. About 40% of them are coming back with either severe or some signs of PTSD, post-traumatic stress distress. Moreover, their families, in many cases, have been left back here with a society that just hasn't been paying enough attention to them, because military families now represent less than 1% of our population. The other 99% of us are not even asked to think about these wars. We don't have to get up in the morning and worry about the phone ringing or a military vehicle arriving in the driveway as they do. So that's the place where the country, I think, can knit itself together again. This is a big, bold idea that we need to be addressing about how do we reintegrate these returning veterans into a civil society and not just make it a seasonal exercise. I've done a fair amount of research on this, and it turns out every society that has sent people off to war has had a hard time finding a place for them once they get home again. Because they grow up at a very early age in a military culture. They're trained to kill bad guys. The Army will say, we break them down and make them what we need them to be. We need them to be part of a team, which everybody has their back, and we need them to rely on that culture to get them through it. Moreover, they're told what they're going to eat when they get up in the morning, what they're going to wear, and now we dump them back into a society which technology is running rampant. It's changing the way we do everything, and people are not paying attention to them. So that's a place, I think, where we can begin to pull ourselves back together again. And there are some really wonderful efforts that are underway at the corporate and public sector as well. I've convened a national summit in New York on May 7th, in which we're bringing in what we think are the best of the efforts at the major corporate level, GE, Coca-Cola, JP Morgan, Chase, and others, and then middle and small businesses that are doing things. And we're going to try to learn from each other so we can create a model for the rest of the country. But it's also dependent on each of us to just reach out to families and say, how can I help? Can I babysit the kids on a Saturday so you can have some free time? Can I do some shopping for you? it's not just a role of citizenship. There's a kind of moral factor here as well. We owe it to these people to treat them as our fellow citizens. They're risking their lives on our behalf. So that's one idea. I think that elections ought to be about big ideas. And I'm at that stage in my life. I have grandchildren now, and I look at them and I wonder, what are they going to have for their lives? So I hope that the fall will bring an election that revolves around big ideas. When President Reagan ran against Jimmy Carter, those were big ideas that were in play. And there were really sharp divisions between the two of them, what they wanted for the country. And the country had a chance to look at these two men, to watch them in debates, to study their positions, and then make a choice. And that's what elections ought to be about.
You know, you talk in your book about the military, those that oftentimes pay the ultimate sacrifice for their country. And you wind back into the times of the Great Depression and World War II and that whole generation. And it seems to me a constant theme that you strike on. It's all about how those generations put forth some sort of sacrifice to make it through. And now as you spin the clock forward and we look at the really tough economic conditions the country's in now, it seems to me like your view is that it's time for every American to consider how they might sacrifice in today's age in order to help each other make it through. But at the same time, it doesn't feel to me like you think it's really sacrifice. What it really is about is just plain old common sense and living within your means. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I can. I'm obviously a product of the greatest generation. I caught that great wave. I was born in 1940, so I remember my first memories of life were World War II. We lived on an army base, and my dad and mother had gone through a very, very difficult time in the Great Depression, but they never gave up hope. They didn't whine about it. They just kind of put one foot in front of another. My dad raced all over the Midwest. He was an extraordinarily skilled heavy equipment operator in construction jobs. Then we lived on an army base during the war. And when the war was over, there were so many things to be done in America, and everybody was eager to have some prosperity again. So there was this vibrancy about the interstate highway system being built. We were working on the big dams on the Missouri River in South Dakota, for example. And manufacturing was taking hold in the country. But at the same time, and it had to do, I think, with both the Great Depression experience and World War II. In every community, people were stepping up and stepping out to help everybody else. I lived in little working class towns, and the American Legion was there to sponsor the baseball team. And the mothers would get together and they would all be the Cub Scout leaders, and then the guys would be the Boy Scout leaders. And in the towns in which I lived, people were coming and going a lot because the jobs were shifting, so the kids would kind of get together and form baseball teams, and then the grown-ups would come together and say, well, we're going to help you out with that. Everybody felt they had a dual obligation to their family and to the extended family. I think that we've lost some of that. There's still an enormous amount of good work that is done in this country, but people move around a lot now. They live in areas that are separate from where they grew up, or they live in gated communities and walled off from one another. And not much has been asked of us in a kind of extraordinary way. So the phrase that I've been using is that it's time for all of us to re-enlist as citizens, to find one thing that we can do that goes beyond our own sphere of self-interest, something that we can do for the community. And I think it's extremely important to be doing that for the generation coming of age. They need to know about that.
I got the sense on that topic in your book, Tom, that you were maybe even going so far as to suggest that we, as a big idea, should consider national service, essentially drafting, when you come of age, people into some element of public service in one way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I have a big idea, and I think the chances are it's going to be very tough to pull this off, but I want to generate a conversation about it. Young people, especially now coming out of college, given the nature of the economy, are looking for something else they can do. For example, Teach for America is just overwhelmed with applications because there are not a lot of great jobs out there, and people see this as an interim step and a way for them to get involved. We still have the Peace Corps. We have other programs in which people can get involved, but they tend to be less than the sum of their parts. And there doesn't seem to be a sense of obligation about them. We're not going to have the military draft come back. Military doesn't want it. They love volunteers. They're highly motivated. They don't want to get into the politics of a draft again like we did in Vietnam. So one of the proposals that I make in the book that I feel very strongly about is that we ought to have public service academies modeled roughly on the military academies, and say we have 6 of them across America attached to land-grant schools. Cornell is a land-grant school. Kansas State is a land-grant school. And when I was trying this out with our friend Jim Baker in Texas, he had a friend there from Houston who is a very successful big businessman, now owns a Houston, Texas, and Bob McNair said to me, make it public and private. That opened up a whole other area for me to think about. So you could have the Johnson & Johnson Fellow in medicine. And the Johnson & Johnson Fellows in medicine would not just be physicians, but they would be nurse practitioners and technicians and that kind of thing. You'd have the John Deere Fellow in agriculture, and agroeconomics, which is a very big part of our future, how we're going to grow enough food for everybody. And then you have the Caterpillar Fellow in construction, everything from engineers to operating engineers of the heavy equipment. You could have the Donald Trump Fellow in hair design if you wanted to. There are no end of opportunities here. And they spend 3 years getting this special training, or 4 years, and physicians get in postgraduate, and then they get assigned domestically and internationally to do the work that needs to be done. And at the end of a 3-year term or a 4-year term, they're brought back to the home company, the sponsoring company, and they have 2 or 3 years to prove themselves about whether they have a worth to the company. Now, I happen to think that if you're at Caterpillar, which is a big global company, if you got somebody that you can send out to Southeast Asia or to the emerging markets in South America, and they come back with an understanding of the culture and the language and everything, that's a win-win. And you've participated in kind of finishing off these young people who have something to do. When Katrina happened, this is when it struck me again, as it often does. When Katrina happened, I was down in the flooded 4th District, and I was in a boat with the 82nd Airborne, and they had just gotten there. It was like 8 days into the rescue operations. And I said to the young major, who was just, you know, as you might expect, whip smart and really organized, and he had his guys spreading out. There were still a lot of people isolated in their homes. And I said, aren't you guys getting ready to go to Afghanistan? And he said, yes, sir. And he said, this has really interrupted our training, but they just didn't have anybody else to send here. Well, we can't mix those kinds of assignments. So you could have teams trained domestically to go in and do that. Moreover, I believe that in the rest of the world, we just can't keep putting a military face on the United States. You know, everything in Baghdad and everything in Iraq is military, and it has to be. And they're told to go out and win hearts and minds, but also kill all the bad guys. Well, those missions can become incompatible. I've been embedded with the Special Forces and with the 10th Mountain Division, and it's harrowing work. These are the smartest, most motivated people you can possibly imagine, but when they get to a village and they say, we're here to help, the village is, I'm not so sure, because they've just had to shake down all the trucks in the village to make sure they don't have contraband weapons, and they've had to search the buildings and so on. So we need to find a way to deal with the realities of the new world of the 21st century. And I would hope that maybe we could begin to have a real conversation about public service in that scale.
Another area where it feels like your view is we cannot afford to fall any further behind. In fact, we have to advance is on the education front. Yeah. And you point to example after example, really heroic examples where individuals, some from private corporations, some from the education system, step forward and find some miraculous way to turn a school or a community around. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are with respect to the roles of the average parent, of parents out there, and what, how can they contribute to this?
Well, the most encouraging thing about education at the moment for me is that it's on the agenda, that we're beginning to talk about it and pay attention to it. And I completely get the pressure on parents. I have only daughters, and I was raised in a family with 3 boys and a hard-hat construction foreman father, and God got even with me and said, "You're going to be surrounded by women for the rest of your life." They are unbelievably accomplished, every one of them, but they're working mothers and they're professionals. And watching them balance that, for example, what they have to do, and they've got high-profile jobs, and then raising the kids. So I know what the pressures are on parents. Now, they get a lot of help from their extended family, their grandparents and others, about educating the kids. But if you take a working-class family in which the mother has to go off at 6 o'clock in the morning before breakfast to report for a job, and the father maybe is working the graveyard shift, midnight to 8 a.m., and the kids are going to school. I find this wherever I go in schools. I'll talk to principals, and I'll say, "What's your problem?" And he said, "I got young people coming through there, they haven't talked to an adult in 4 days because their parents are so busy on their jobs and there's no one home. So I try to meet them at the front door and remember their name and try to get." That, again, is a case where the rest of us can take a part. I think the mix that we now have underway is the answer. You've got to have everything from traditional public schools to charter schools. In New York, especially, we have the parochial schools. The Catholic Diocese does a good job because they don't have the same kind of population coming in anymore. And we have to have really tough standards because we're not just competing with each other. In China, every 8th grader takes courses in physics, in biology, in fundamental math, and general science. 18% of our high school students take those courses. 40% of our high school students who are going off to college have to take remedial reading and remedial math courses. We can't compete unless we change that equation. It's hard work. But what I'm telling young people now when I do my commencement addresses is you have a chance to really imprint your generation. I put it in the context of the greatest generation. They can't do it on their own. And the reason I wrote this book is that I thought I've got to speak to my generation about what are we leaving behind and how do we step up and say, we're the beneficiaries of the good educations that we've got, now we've got to help out with it.
You also delve into technology, and I know you've seen a lot of changes covering news in your career. Now we've got, everyone's got a Twitter account, they're on Facebook, YouTube, all these different ways of communicating, and it seems like we're forming these new communities. But at the same time, do you get a sense that we're also losing a sense of community because of the advantage of these technologies?
Yeah, I think it's the most transformative thing I have ever seen in my lifetime, and I never expected to see it. And it's changed the way all of us communicate with each other, the way we do business, the way medical research is done, the sharing that you can accomplish. But with young people, by the way, it's the first technology in which the young people are teaching their parents how to drive because they're better at it. I have been utterly fascinated by it, and I'm staying on top of it just as much as I can, but I have to run really fast to do that. And what I say to young people is, I know how fascinated you are about your ability to exchange social messages and relationships with your friends, to expand your circle with Facebook, or to have tweets going all day long. I got news for you. No tweet will ever replace someone whispering in your ear, "I love you." I don't ever want to hear a song that begins, I don't ever want to hear a song that begins, "A tweet is just a tweet," as time goes by. And they get it. And they're creating their own new culture. We're doing it on the fly. My issue with the technology is we've not had a national dialogue about it. We don't talk about it enough. I talk to a lot of parents who come to me and say, "Well, you'll not believe little Johnny. He is a real whiz kid on the internet." And I said, "Do you have any idea where he's going?" And they look at me and they say, "What do you mean?" I said, "You can go anywhere in the world on the internet." And and a lot of the stuff is really dark. And then they come to me about 5 days later and said, oh my God, every time we approach the room, we hear click, 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 and he's logging off wherever he'd been. So parents need to talk to their kids, and the rest of us need to talk to each other about what this technology can do for us, because it can change the way we position ourselves in the world and the way we understand each other. But at the same time, it won't happen just by accident. It really has to have specific applications, and that ought to be a part of it. It would be a wasted opportunity otherwise. One of the lines that I use, it will do us little good to wire the world if we short-circuit our souls. And we need to think about how we use this new technology to raise the level of civilization for everyone and understanding, and use it to advance humankind, and not just to say, I'll meet you for a latte on Tuesday morning somewhere.
Civility. There's a lot in your book about how it's time for us, as we move forward, to start thinking about a return to civility. And when I was reading in a lot of their passages, it reminded me of the days of Ronald Reagan. And the stories that are often told about Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, mortal enemies philosophically, politically speaking. But they still, between the two of them, got an enormous amount done. And it seems to me it was because they knew how to practice civil discourse. Can you take us back to that time?
Yeah, well, there were rough times with the language different, and the pervasiveness of what you can only describe as unacceptable rapacious behavior. It just didn't exist at that time. For example, I'm pretty much a free speech advocate. I think that we should be able to express yourself. But the F word did not exist in public when I was growing up. It just wasn't out there. It wasn't out there. It was in the locker room in high school. And it's not that we were prudes, but there was just a line that was drawn. And everybody kind of helped reinforce that. Then we began to lose those lines. And it doesn't mean that it's going to go away entirely. There's a remarkable film out now called Bully. Some of you may have heard about it. It's a wonderful documentary about what's happened to young people who have been bullied. And what is so poignant about it is that these are families who had not thought about that before until they lost a child to suicide who had been bullied. One of the central figures is a young man who had been born prematurely and had a kind of facial disfiguration. He has Asperger's. On the bus, the filmmaker is able to get this astonishingly and very unsettling video of how he is tormented by fellow students with pencil pokes and slapped and hit, to the point that the filmmaker did something which most filmmakers would struggle with. He stopped filming, he went to the parents, and he went to the school and said, he's in real danger. I watched that film and I thought, we have to have everybody to see this. Everybody, parent does, everybody else. The Motion Picture Association will not give it a PG rating because it has some unusual language in it. Now these kids hear that language all day long in the schools, but now they can't see it. So this is the contradiction. And the other part of it is we had a big discussion about it later, and I said to a friend of mine who came to me quite stunned by having seen it, where does this come from? And I said, it comes from the popular culture. These kids think everything is permissible now. If you look at, pardon me, there may be fans in the room, but if you look at the Kardashians on television, or if you look at Jersey Shore, and the language and the behavior and all, and that, you can have access to that, but parents need to be talking about it, and we need to have it in a context about, does this advance our common interest, and some of it just, something ought to put your hand up at some point. And my friend, who's a well-known liberal commentator, he said, this is hard for liberals to accept, but he said, I think they have to start accepting it, because the inclination is to say, everything is fair game. But at the same time, it has to be in context. If you're going to have it as fair game, then put it in the arena and talk about it and not be afraid to say, it goes too far. I always thought that Tipper Gore got a very bad rap when, within her own party, she wanted to put on albums. There may be language here that could be offensive. That's all that she wanted to do. And there was a lot of pushback. I think you lose those lines after a while, and you begin to develop an uncivil society, and that doesn't advance the interests of anyone. On the other hand, let me just say one other thing. I'm equally offended, however, by those who want us to behave only as they see the world. By the bloggers and others who say, if you don't measure up to my very narrow view of how the world should operate, then I think you're unworthy. That makes me crazy as well. If you're a public person these days, what happens, you end up in the news in the most benign way. Then it ends up on a website, and they have some little description of something that you've done, or you've appeared at some benefit or whatever. Then they say, post your comment, please. And all these people sitting around in basements in their underwear, who no one pays attention, post these vicious comments, and they do it anonymously. They all have, nom de guerre, as it were. Now, I've been at this long enough, it doesn't bother me, but it's, it makes people not want to step into the public arena and take positions that we ought to be talking about.
Yeah. Well, on that topic, I read there might be some budding news anchors in the audience this evening, I don't know, but I was interested to see your advice that you give to young people coming up today that say, hey, you know what, I want to be a news anchor. And you had a particular point of view as to, well, here's what it takes to do it well.
Yeah. Well, what happens is that young people now, and it's understandable, they want to go instantly on the screen, and they want to have agents and publicity people taking care of them, and they want to end up on the pages of magazines. I have this really theatrically gifted granddaughter who's about 15, lives in San Francisco. And her mother and I were talking about it the other day. She said, Clara is really smart. She loves the idea of celebrity. And we really have had to have strong conversations with her about it. You get to be known by doing something worthwhile, you're just not known for being known. And she said, I can see where that's become toxic in our society, because people just like to be known. So what I say to young journalists who are coming along, first of all, when a lot of parents come up to me and they've got this really attractive young man or young woman at their side, and they say, this is my son or daughter, and they want to go into communications or journalism school so they can be an anchor. Do you have any advice? And I always look at them and say, study medicine. And I try to take them aside and say, it's not magic. It's not shake and bake. You get to these positions of some prominence by doing the hard work. I didn't start off from Yankton, South Dakota, and land as a network correspondent and then the Today Show host and nightly news. I learned all along the way. I had the advantage, in a way, of my generation of broadcast journalists, is that newspaper people who were really the best of the breed in those days were kind of my mentors. They were around, and if I began to breathe too deeply the celebrity that comes with the kind of jobs that I have, there was always somebody there to pull my chain and to say, hey, wait a minute, that's not why we got in this business. And that was very helpful. Now it's reinforced by a lot of people. I will say that that's not true of everyone. Matt Lauer, thank God, has just renewed his contract with the Today Show. And he's really first rate. And Matt didn't start off as a traditional journalist. He was really somebody who came into television, not in the entertainment field necessarily, but as a guy who was very good at talk shows and that kind of thing, information, what they call infotainment. He has become one of the best interviewers there is, and he really is serious about the work of the Today Show. But it's hard work, and he's been doing it for 16 years, and God bless him, and thank God he's going to be doing it again. But he's a perfect model of how long it takes to get to the prominence that he has. we like to tease Matt. He was an early television success in Philadelphia, and then the job fell apart, and then another job fell apart. He was literally looking in the want ads to take a job as a tree trimmer in Westchester County when WNBC called him and said, we got an early morning newscast for you to do. So the tree trimming business lost a star and we gained one, as we like to say.
Well, speaking of someone who's worked their whole life really on the front lines of gathering news, I know you've covered every major story in the last 40-some-odd years. Is there any that for one reason or another you found it affected you personally or deeply in one way or another, made you think differently about life?
Well, 9/11 certainly was the single most difficult time that I had, not just that day, but in the days and hours that came after that as well. You know, New York is a collection of small villages. It's not just this big monolithic city, and we've been living there for a long time, and we had friends that were working in the World Trade Center. One of my daughter's closest friends lost her husband that day. Turns out, I found out later, I was scheduled to have breakfast at the World Trade Center that morning, but the guy that I was going to be having breakfast with and introducing couldn't make it, so we had done it the night before, it turns out. And I didn't find out from the organizers until like a week later. And the unexpected trauma of it, about what we were going through and how I knew it would change us, I talked about that. And I'm a pretty emotional person, and all day long I kept trying to keep a check on my emotions, thinking I can't break down on the air because people are relying on me to tell them what's going on. And late in the afternoon, had a guy on the phone who had gotten out, and I said, "What about the rest of your colleagues?" And there was this long pause, and he began to choke up, and he said, "I had 2 colleagues who were in wheelchairs, and when I last saw them, they were waiting for the elevator, and of course, it never came, and they didn't get out." I'm a very active outdoorsman, and I do a lot of work with spinal injuries, in part because I'm very empathetic to people who are in wheelchairs. And I thought, oh my God, that's not fair somehow. I mean, none of it was fair. So that was a single story. A big story that was at once exhilarating and very difficult was the fall of communism in the Soviet Union, for which President Reagan had a very significant role, obviously, and the kind of ripple effect around the world. And being with Nelson Mandela, I'd gotten a tip. I had a friend in the South African government who 4 days before he was released called me and said, "Get here right now, something's going to happen." And so I'd gotten there and gotten in place. And then to see this man walk out with all of his dignity intact, it was as if he'd been away for a 3-day weekend and gotten stranded in a snowstorm or something. And I was in his backyard with him in Soweto after spending all night long out there. And it gave me hope. I thought, this is a critically important man, not just for his population in South Africa, but for the world to see dignity and determination play out in the way that it did. I was very, very close to the space program, and when the Challenger went up, and President and Mrs. Reagan were so critically important in healing the nation. I had been at the White House that day in one of those luncheon briefings when that happened. And Judy Resnick was somebody I knew well. She was one of the astronauts on board. She had been my first expert astronaut when the shuttle program was first starting. That NASA would assign an astronaut to the anchors to help us with the technical stuff. And then Judy and I developed this bet where NASA was always saying, we're going to launch on June 4th at 8:30 a.m. And I'd say, I'll bet it slips. And she'd say, no, we got this one worked out. So we bet a 6-pack on the launch date. And we exchanged a lot of 6-packs over a couple of years. And I went running out of there knowing that she was on board, and that was very difficult to do. So we're not immune to it all. You're mostly touched by the stories from the ground up more than you are from the top down. I was in Somalia when people were dying in front of me, infants, and I thought I was prepared for it, and I wasn't. It was really a hard 2 weeks.
A few questions from those in the audience. First is there any hope that the network news programs will regain their past luster?
Well, here's a surprising observation for all of you. It's really incumbent upon all of us. There's an enormous amount of good work being done. The screen is just a lot wider and it's got a lot more parts to it. You know, I grew up when NBC and CBS had a duopoly. ABC was not yet a player in the early days of network news. We liked that. You know, who doesn't like to have kind of charge of the network screens every night at 6:30? And we had Chet Huntley and David Brinkley and Walter Cronkite and great teams behind them. The news in that day, in fairness, that you got on a regular basis was all seen through the prism of white middle-aged men who lived on the Atlantic seaboard. That was fine with me because I was going to be one of them, I knew one day. But we have a much richer environment now that exists out there. But the obligation is of, we can't be couch potatoes anymore. There was a time in the lives of most of you in this audience, looking at the gray heads that are out there, when you'd get up in the morning, you'd catch a little bit of the Today Show, maybe read a morning newspaper, go off to work, come home at night, and have appointment television. You'd watch Walter or Chet and David. And then maybe you'd catch a little bit of the late news at night, and you could go to bed and you'd be pretty well read in on what was going on. Now it comes at you all day long. I mean, it is truly drinking from a fire hydrant. So what you have to do, and what I do, and I have to remind myself of it constantly, I have to work harder at determining which sources I can trust and serve my needs. And they're very, very rich. The internet gives me the whole world to choose from on a regular basis. And if I see something on the evening news, whether it's Brian or Diane or Scott, and I think, I wonder if that adds up, I can go in and get supplemental information on it very quickly. And I'm a much better served news consumer at the end of the day. But I have to work harder at it. I have to work harder, and we all have to work harder at it. I have a friend who's the editor of the Financial Times of London. I never thought in my lifetime I could get up in the middle of the night. There's a lot of you probably have an iPad. One of my friends said, what's the iPad for? iPad's for old men who wake up in the middle of the night, want to read the New York Times before it arrives at the front door. And that's what I do. I wake up in the middle of the night, click, I hit the Financial Times because it's London time, and I get an idea of what he's doing, and it's very, very helpful to me. So they're still doing exceptional work. Here's a perfect example. Last week, Richard Engel, our chief foreign correspondent, was in North Korea all week long. That was a tough, difficult assignment. If you look at the coverage of Arab Spring, that was exceptional. All the networks did a really brilliant job of covering that and putting it in context. Some of them were in grave, grave danger. That's still going on in Syria, obviously. The coverage of the wars, same thing. So there's a lot of good work. It's the shouting and the opinions, mostly on cable, that tends to drown out a lot of the good work.
Did you ever ride on the Air Force One that's here? And if so, what is your best memory from that?
Well, there are never bad trips on Air Force One. Well, there was one bad trip. When Richard Nixon was in the final throes of Watergate, it was not fun to be on Air Force One. The press there's always a press component. You're called a press pool. And you ride on, and the early days of Air Force One, you rode in a very small compartment in the back, and you were pretty much confined to quarters. It was much more relaxed in the President Reagan era. You could get up and move around, and it was always special. And there wasn't a reporter, no matter how many times he or she had been on board Air Force One, who wasn't pilfering napkins, M&Ms, jelly beans, pens, whatever they could get their hands on to do it. But Air Force One is about the president's security and his team. The press is along kind of for the ride, and that's good. The good duty in the old days, and I only got on this one time, was Henry Kissinger had a very small coterie of people who followed him around. We used to, those of us who were White House correspondents, used to call him Kissinger's choir because he treated him very well. And I got on the plane one time, and there's always supposed to be a distance between the reporters and the sources that you're covering. And we saw the Kissinger magic at work instantly. There were two of us from outside his little choir. Plane levels, we'd been in China and Indonesia and the Philippines, and we were leaving Japan. And the plane finally gets at altitude, and all my fellow press guys get up and start muckling. I said, "Where are you going?" They said, "We're going to cocktails." And so Henry would have everybody up for a little cocktail session and exchange gossip with them and feed them well and everything. And of course, that's how he kept him reasonably well trained as his press corps. So.
I like this one because it seems a little bit like a job interview, Tom. What do you consider your greatest achievement, and what was your greatest disappointment?
Well, it's, first of all, if there's an oxymoron in American life, it is humble anchorman, so don't expect me to give a humble answer. I like to think that my greatest achievement is that I can come here and be reasonably well received based on my long career, that I worked really hard at getting it right and trying to put it in context, not just make it factual, but to try to explain what the larger meaning of these developments are. And, from time to time, I'd bump up against my friends. Mrs. Reagan and I had one little, I wouldn't call it a head-banging thing, but we had a little difference over something that I'd said. And so I was told not to come around the White House for a while. And then I was told I was to come to a White House state dinner, and I was to think about what I was to say to Mrs. Reagan when I met her in the receiving line. And so I did. I thought, and they said, "Don't worry about the president. He's not aware of this." So Meredith was with me, and we're invited, and their great chief of staff, Jim Baker, who's become a really close friend of mine and was as good at that job as anybody I'd ever seen. I write in the book that you ought to have a buddy system in life. You ought to have people that you can count on to help you. Ronald Reagan had Nancy Reagan and Jim Baker, and boy, that was a team that you really wanted to be around. So anyhow, I go down to the White House, and we're in the receiving line, and Meredith Brokaw, who seldom gets nervous, is getting more and more anxious. She keeps saying, "What are you going to say?" And I get up to Mrs. Reagan, who's standing there. We have not talked in like a month because of her unhappiness with the comment that I'd made. And I looked at her for just a moment, and I then laughed, and I said, "Nancy, back to square one." And she laughed after a beat and said, "I'm back to square one." The White House photographer caught the moment. The two of us like this, laughing. And 2 days later, at my office in New York, arrived a photograph from Nancy Reagan, signed to Tom, "Back to square one, love Nancy." That was one more. As one more example, that if she wasn't the best politician in the White House, it was only because Ronald Reagan was standing next to her at the time, but she really was great at it. And everything was fine after that, that she understood what the terms were. And I had been told, by the way, that the president was oblivious to all of this. So when his extraordinary diaries came out that were edited by Douglas Brinkley, I keep them on my bedside because I read constantly presidential history. It kind of helps with the context of things. I've been very interested in, for example, how he has been, in many cases, misrepresented in the course of this year, even by members of his own party, about what his attitudes were about getting things done and compromises that you had to in budget negotiations. But like everybody else, when you get a book that has to do with Washington and you're involved, you go to the back and look for your name and then go try to find it. And the night after that, the night of that dinner, the president goes back to the living quarters and he writes about, "We had President de la Madrid of Mexico here tonight, and also Tom Brokaw was a guest. He said something about me that was not appropriate recently, but I think he's had second thoughts." So I thought, he doesn't miss anything, frankly.
Well, we have time for one last question, and this one's mine, but it's less of a question and just a request that you tell a little story. It's another White House moment, and I heard you tell the story a year or two ago, and it's about, I think it's the president's last day in office, or right near one of the very
Right.
last days, that I thought was such a poignant moment, and I think the audience would just love to hear it.
Well, I'll give you the context for it. When I came here in 1966, I was 26 years old, and I had just turned 26. It was a huge leap for Meredith and me. We'd been married just 3 years earlier, and suddenly we were in California. I was working for the network, well beyond any timetable I might have had in mind. And they said, we'd like you to start, because we hear that you're good at political coverage, we'd like you to start by covering Ronald Reagan, who's running for the Republican nomination. He'd not yet gotten the nomination. So I got on buses with them, and I went down to the Wilshire Ebel Theater, where they had kind of a rehearsal of the speech that he was going to be doing, and got to know Stu Spencer and the other people who were around him. And I spent a lot of time on the campaign. And then, of course, he was elected governor, and I spent a lot of time while I was here in the first term doing interviews with him and going up and covering it. When I went back to Washington as a White House correspondent, and there was still skepticism in the East about whether Ronald Reagan could get elected president, I'd always say, he's coming, I promise you, you'll be dealing with this at some point. So we had a really long, rich relationship as very successful politician and the reporter who was privileged to be a part of that. I asked for the last interview that he was in office. It was the Friday before he left. And it was all very carefully worked out, as all presidential interviews are. But by then, things had dialed down so much he didn't have much else on his schedule. So at 11:30 in the morning, he came into the Oval Office, and I had been told that he would sit down at 11:30. At 11:59, I would have to wrap up the interview. He would turn, thank the crew, and then Ken Duberstein said, he also wants to take you out on the portico. We don't know what that's about, but he'll come back in, have his picture taken with the crew, and he'll thank them again, and then he'll exit through that door over there at 12:15. It all went off like clockwork. The president arrived at 11:30. I was doing a story about his earliest days as part of a larger documentary about how he learned to read and his relationship with his mother and those halcyon days in the summer when he was a lifeguard. And it was very winning stuff, won a lot of awards, the whole documentary did. And at the end of the interview, I said at 11:59, thank you, Mr. President. He said, Tom, thank you. And he turned and thanked the crew. And he said, Tom, why don't we go out on the portico? And I said, gee, Mr. President, what a good idea. And so we go out on the portico, and the staff is still quite puzzled. I can see in the expressions in their eyes. They don't know what this is all about. We go out there, and we're standing there, and suddenly a photographer appeared. And the president's carrying on a conversation with me, and he says, Nancy and I were talking this morning at breakfast, Tom. You were there from the very beginning. And I said, I was, Mr. President. It was a great privilege to be able to cover your great, distinguished career. The photographer's taking pictures, and the president put his arm around me with that Ronald Reagan twinkle in his eye. He looked at me and he said, it worked out pretty well for both of us, didn't it? I'll cherish that moment forever.
I cannot think of a better way to end the evening. Tom, thank you so much for coming to see us.
Thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tom.
That was great. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you. If I could ask everyone just to keep their seat until Mrs. Reagan and Tom make their way through the doors, it'd be terrific. Thank you so much for coming. After your time.